I was part of a detail sent to a village that disappeared. Part 2. So sorry this has taken me so long to get out. I messaged my contact just after posting Part 1, but I only just heard back. I asked them to some of the questions you guys asked, and they sent me this as a response. You can find the reply and link to the first part below. The email reply as follows. How much do you know about these things? Unfortunately, not nearly as much as I'd like. I spent close to a decade compiling every piece of information I've been able to find on these things, but even next to the bursting filing cabinet beside my desk, I feel like I know so little. Do you think this is related to other UFO phenomena? The short answer is that no. I do not believe that this is the same phenomena described by ufologists and alien abductees. I don't personally believe these stories. I consider this to be something new, something that started in the 2000s. Maybe they were here before that, but there's no evidence to suggest that they were present prior to at least 2003. Between 2003 and 2005, I heard of 3 more incidents like the ones we discussed last week, and I now know the actual number to be closer to 7. The visitors, for lack of a better word, were particularly active during this period. I'm not sure if Peru was the first of its kind, but I do know that Bhutan was the event immediately afterwards, although I wouldn't hear about it until 2004. After that came an incident you likely heard about as a minor aviation disaster, although the real version comes with a small caveat. There were no bodies. There is also several unconfirmed incidents which may or may not constitute events, including 2 sets of disappearances on Everest. But the real big one that changed everything happened in Afghanistan. I got the background on this from 2 sources. One was a radar tech for the U.S. Army working in the Afghan half of the Hindu Kush Mountains around 2005, which was just a barrel of laughs at that time. The second, funnily enough, is a Guantanamo detainee. I only read about that side of it, and it's a document I'll never admit to having seen. God knows a part of me wishes I hadn't. I'm told it wasn't uncommon to see something moving fast and hot on radar, although usually it ended with an explosion. Boom. Missiles, rockets, that kind of thing. Well, my friend was starting to see a lot more blips that were unaccounted for. Every so often, something would come down out of the mountains, arc over the valley, and head back up. No visual, although it wasn't that uncommon. Al-Qaeda had itself backed up there like a cobra in a basket, but their flying objects had a tendency to, well, kill somebody. These were just anomalies. One day, one of these things went to ground way up in hostile territory in the mountains where they were stretched pretty thin. It might not surprise you to learn that Islamists tend to be of the superstitious variety, but these guys thought for all the world that they had a jinn on their hands, and they were terrified. If you're unfamiliar with Islamic mythology, the jinn are invisible beings separate from both humans and angels and known for trickery. These mountains are remote, far too remote for a large military presence. Usually, NATO would just rain hellfire down on them and the camps would either burn, disperse, or go into hiding and wait for the next rallying call. The camp in question, an Al-Qaeda training ground, was of the third case. They kept their ear to the airwaves, but other than that, they'd been maintaining radio silence for fear of the righteous judgment of another airstrike. Nobody but the radar techs had seen this thing go down, so as far as they knew, they were alone up there. Imagine being that guy, listening for broadcasts as they always did, knowing that there's nobody out there for miles, when you hear the words, Kichare. That's Pashto for hello, and I'm sorry if my pronunciation on here has garbled it. I didn't know any of this when I landed in Kabul, though in hindsight I probably wouldn't have come out if I had. There were no more than 60 people involved in Peru. That number was more or less repeated for Bhutan and every incident that had followed, but within 20 minutes of being on the ground, I'd seen several hundred people preparing to take the northeast track to the mountains. To be frank, I wasn't thrilled with the idea of driving 130 miles through enemy territory, but it wasn't the journey that scared the heck out of me. Whatever was happening up there, it was big. I suppose being involved in Peru and my years since working directly for the task force meant I got a higher level of clearance than I had in the Andes, because almost the second I was on the ground, they whisked me away from the tarmac to an unnumbered building about half a mile away for a mid-tier briefing. We were told that the 30 or so people in that room would reach the mountain ahead of all of the military arm flexing, in the hopes of actually communicating with this thing. I'm not sure if I was more scared of the fact that it was all happening again, only bigger, or the fact that I was in a room with people who were actually admitting the existence of an EBE, though they only ever referred to it as the entity. I suppose they just expected us to read between the lines. I learned two main things in that briefing. One, we were dealing with a potential first contact scenario. From what we knew, there was at least one entity in the mountains sending radio messages to the Al-Qaeda base in question, and most of their messages out to us stopped making sense the moment they decided this was a jinn, though it was clear the reason they were surrendering was because they were isolated with it, and handling themselves over to the sworn enemies was less terrifying than dealing with it alone. I'll let that sink in for a moment. Second, this event was different from anything we'd witnessed before. For a start, it was predictable, at least in the sense that we knew it was happening and knew where to find it. It also might have been able to give us some insight into the motives of the entities, which up until then had consisted purely of hostile abductions. If there was a way to somehow negotiate with them and find out what they wanted, well, all the better. Nobody said it, but we were all thinking it. The camp was bait. We were the fish. It took us maybe an hour to prepare, and then 4 hours to drive into the valley at the base of the mountain. Then another half-hour helicopter ride up to where the small military detachment had already apprehended our terrorists, the latter having dug themselves into a cave. It was sunset by the time we got up there, which I was not okay with. I was not okay with that. Everything I knew told me that these things were just more active at night. And besides that, a lot about the whole thing brought back bad memories of Peru. My official job was, again, to watch for signs of a pathogen that may or may not have existed, and the mountains were empty of any and all wildlife. If anything lived up there, then it had got the heck out before we arrived. We were supposed to meet the qualified gun havers and their reinforcements up at said cave. We never got there. Our instructions were to radio when we arrived, and a military escort would come down the slope and take us up to the mud cave. One of us signaled our arrival the moment we got there, but there was no reply. Nothing. It was dark enough by then that the sun was just a cool yellow band on the horizon. I wasn't sure if it was me or the oxygen deprivation speaking, but I had a bad feeling that I was about to leave I wasn't sure if it was me or the oxygen deprivation speaking, but I had a bad feeling that I was about to have all my questions about the entity answered at once. We started hearing these noises on the radio. Everyone had one, and several of us had them on the loudspeaker. Pops and whistles played in the open air like echoes of each other, and then what sounded like somebody humming. That grew into a noise that's impossible for me to describe. Like if you were to take a set of human lungs with the larynx attached and play it like a bagpipe, that would come close, maybe. Then it formed a word. It was not a human voice. The best way I can describe it is to say it reminded me of a crow I'd once heard imitating human speech. Still, we banked our hopes on the fact that it was just the military detail. Maybe they'd encountered some interference from the cave, so we replied, assuming that that was it. It was not. "Bring you on the mountain, why?" was the response. The way they talk reminds me of those CAPTCHAs you get on the net. The ones that string random words together to stop bots and scripts from accessing websites. A thing with a poor understanding of human language trying to emulate it. By then, we were fully aware that what we were conversing with was not the military detail. So, I asked a question. What do you want from us? It was the only thing I'd been wondering since Peru. Seriously. The only thing. What was their motive? Why the abductions? Were they learning about us, trying to make contact and having no luck? Maybe it was actually peaceful.
There you were, the burned mountain village.
I could not feel the ground under my feet at that moment. Maybe I'm anthropomorphizing this thing too much. Maybe it was referencing the fact that the military regularly burned down the villages on this mountain. But I had the distinct feeling that what it was saying was that it had seen me on that mountain in the Andes. That it was either the same thing or was aware that I had been there via another of its kind. It recognized me. It was too dark to see the summit. I could have been a goat or something, but rocks started sliding from high up and I trained my eyes on the mountain, refusing to blink as I looked for shapes in the darkness. When our electrical equipment started to malfunction, lights flickering, radios switching on and off, we silently but unanimously decided it was time to get the fuck out. The problem was that by the time we were all back in the choppers, none of it worked. At all. Including the choppers. For a moment, it looked like the mountain itself had grown. Then we realized there was a dark mist coming down the summit towards us, thick enough that the stars were invisible beyond it. I could physically hear my heart thumping in my chest, but there was nowhere to go. We closed the helicopter doors, stuffed clothing and anything else we could find into the vents and aircon, and waited. By the time the mist hit us, there was an ambient yellow light that I couldn't find the source on. Everything seemed to glow, and I'm not sure if it was just the lighting, but the mist itself seemed brown. Like the color of iodine, the stuff that's used for sterilizing before surgery. Eventually, it was thick enough that I couldn't see out the window anymore, so we waited. Some of us were praying, most of us were just panting. Eventually, it got inside. The only way we realized was that the pungent smell of cloves and metal filled the cabin. It had some anesthetic quality to it that messed with our heads. 1 minute, I couldn't feel my tongue. The next, I thought the guy next to me was the entity, and I had to resist the urge to punch the poor bastard. I have trouble remembering the next set of events in order. I know the order because I've seen it on paper, but in my head, everything is coagulated into this one ball of madness. Something started moving out there, stirring the mist up enough that I could see it swirling, but too fast to see directly. Then, the helicopter lurched sideways, and we realized in horror that something was on top of us. The next thing I remember is the door ripping open, which can't be right. The soldier that shoved the gas mask over my face wouldn't have been able to approach if that thing was still up there. All around us, the light of the handheld flares glowed in the mist, and we had to limp on numb feet to where the military had set up some basic cover in a natural trench. They'd been there the whole time. And this thing was screeching, wailing. I don't know what to call it, but it was louder than any biological organism I've ever heard. It had to have been half a mile away, but the sound it made resonated in my bones as if my body was vibrating. And that's where my story ends. But thanks to years of nightmare-fueled research, I've been able to uncover a little more of the truth of what happened that night. The military arrived early on and apprehended the terrorists, and this thing tried to strike up a conversation the moment they were on the mountain. It knew they wanted to make contact with it, so it asked them to come into a ravine between two mountains in the promise of talk and peace. The army wasn't going to have a bar of that. Eventually, they managed to bargain with it, if that's even the right word. We're not coming to you, but there are some people coming up in helicopters who are qualified to speak on behalf of our species. Talk to them. If it came out of hiding and communicated, that would be good. If it didn't, well, they wouldn't be the ones that attacked. Great. 2 years later, with the mist finally beginning to dissipate, I saw... 2 hours later, with the mist finally starting to dissipate, I saw a cargo chopper fly southwest carrying some kind of cylinder underneath it. Actually, it was one of 7 with 6 decoys. Somehow I knew the moment I saw it that what they're carrying was, in fact, the entity itself. I never received confirmation on that, but the events of the months following confirmed, at least to me, that the USA had acquired its own, bona fide, extraterrestrial biological entity. The rage I feel about being the lure in NATO's bid to catch it is offset by the chill I feel in knowing that, for a short moment, I was the rope in an interstellar game of tug-of-war. The military had spent the afternoon quietly moving troops into the mountain, using our arrival as a way of drawing its attention away from the fact that there was some bleeding-edge equipment being carried up the slope. I doubt that it ever worked. In all honesty, I suspect it was fully aware that we were planning something against it, but if I had to place a bet on why we succeeded, I'd say it was due to a poor understanding of our nature. That day, we met the only other species to our knowledge that is capable of communicating, articulating, and orchestrating a well-thought deception. We only survived because it was just as surprised to see those same traits in us. In all their abductions, whatever the hell they'd been doing since they arrived, they still didn't understand much about human disposition. We're the worst damn species on this planet, and we'll do anything to get our way. I don't think they'll ever forget that fact. 4 of those 6 decoys disappeared. So that was part 2 of I Was Part of a Detail Sent to a Village That Disappeared. I just read that out loud without looking at the title for the first time. Yeah, this was written by Miss Nixit over on Reddit. I will leave a link below. She is awesome for giving me permission to read this story out loud. Would you call it a single story or a double story, considering there's 2 parts to it? I don't know. Write your comments below. And if you have a story, if you have an Easter horror story of some kind, feel free to post it on my own subreddit that I now have set up. It's over on, of course, Reddit, under Little Horror Stories. As well, feel free to like and subscribe. Comment below. Do you think extraterrestrials are real? Have a good evening. Beware of the dark, because that's where the monsters hide.